Before O.J. Simpson and the Menendez brothers, there was a case so shocking it set the stage for America's true crime obsession. Picture this: a group of young, wealthy men, living in the lap of luxury in Beverly Hills, plotting a scheme that would make their wildest dreams come true. They were known as the Billionaire Boys Club, a name that promised access, riches, and power. But beneath the surface of luxury cars, high-end suits, and parties in exclusive mansions was a deadly game of betrayal, manipulation, and murder. What started as a simple Ponzi scheme selling fake investments to the rich spiraled into something much darker. As they gained the trust of their victims, the boys played a dangerous game, pushing the limits of greed. And when their deception began to fall apart, they didn't just face the threat of losing everything. No, they crossed a line that would forever change their fates. They resorted to murder to cover up their tracks. In a world where wealth and privilege are often seen as shields against the law, this case tore that illusion to pieces. The tragic end of Ron Levin, a wealthy businessman connected to their fraudulent activities, exposed the dark truth of the Billionaire Boys Club and made headlines that would shock the nation. Before the Menendez brothers' family murders or O.J. Simpson's infamous trial, the Billionaire Boys Club was a story that had everyone talking. It was the case that ignited a nationwide fascination with true crime, setting the stage for a string of notorious trials and chilling tales that would follow. This is the story of the original scandal that captivated a generation and left the world questioning just how far some would go for money and power. In the 1980s, Beverly Hills was the epitome of wealth, excess, and privilege. It was a place where the elite flaunted their fortunes, surrounded by luxury cars, sprawling mansions, and high-profile parties. The world of the rich seemed like an exclusive club, one that only a select few could enter. But within this world, there was a darker side, one where power and money were used to manipulate, deceive, and control. And that's exactly where the Billionaire Boys Club thrived. The club itself wasn't just a group of privileged young men, it was a symbol of the decadent, get-rich-quick culture that defined the era. Led by Joe Hunt, a charismatic and manipulative figure, the group promised its members unimaginable wealth and success. They targeted affluent individuals, selling them the dream of high returns on investments. But the investments were fake, the returns non-existent. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, built on lies and deception. For these young men, living in a world where money was endless, the idea of fraud seemed like just another game until they crossed the line into something far darker. Their target market? The same wealthy elites who could easily be swindled due to their trust in their peers and their thirst for more wealth. They fed off the very system that rewarded them for their connections, while preying on the vulnerabilities of those who believed they could beat the system. As the club grew, so did their arrogance. They began to believe they were untouchable, above the law. But as with many stories of unchecked ambition, it wasn't long before their web of lies began to unravel, leading to a series of events that would bring their criminal world crashing down. The Billionaire Boys Club wasn't just a scam, it was the precursor to the kind of high-profile crimes that would dominate headlines for decades to come. The Billionaire Boys Club (BBC) wasn't just a collection of rich kids, it was a group of dangerous individuals who used charm, manipulation, and calculated deceit to achieve their goals. At the heart of this group was Joe Hunt, the charismatic and calculating leader, whose ambition pushed him and his followers to unimaginable lengths. But while Joe was the mastermind, he was far from the only player in this deadly game. Together, these men created one of the most notorious criminal enterprises of the 1980s, a story that would eventually capture the nation's attention. Joe Hunt, the founder of the Billionaire Boys Club, was the ringmaster of this high-stakes con. A former child prodigy with a passion for wealth and power, Hunt was a master manipulator who had a knack for convincing people to invest in his schemes. He was a persuasive speaker, charming his victims into believing they were part of an exclusive investment opportunity that would make them rich. Hunt promised high returns on investments, using his sharp intellect to create a facade of legitimacy. But behind the charm was a ruthless individual who would stop at nothing to maintain his luxurious lifestyle. Hunt's upbringing in the upper middle class fueled his desire for more, and his fascination with wealth was compounded by his obsession with the status it brought. He was a man who felt entitled to the riches he claimed to be on the brink of attaining. However, as his schemes progressed, his arrogance grew, and it became clear that Hunt was willing to go to any lengths, including murder, to protect his empire of lies. Though Hunt was the mastermind, the BBC was comprised of other key members, who played pivotal roles in executing the crimes. These individuals were often drawn to the group because of its promises of wealth and a lavish lifestyle, but they quickly became complicit in the lies and violence that would follow. One of the central figures in the Billionaire Boys Club was William Walters, a smooth-talking conman who became one of Hunt's most trusted allies. Walters was responsible for much of the financial dealings of the operation, helping Hunt secure wealthy victims and manage the money they scammed. He was also an essential part of the group's social circle, ingratiating himself with the affluent targets of their Ponzi scheme. Walter's ability to blend in with the elite class made him an invaluable asset to the BBC. He acted as a link between the high society that the group sought to exploit and the criminal underworld they were creating. Another key member was Andy Kahan, a fellow conman who brought a unique set of skills to the table. Kahan, who had previously been involved in shady financial deals, was instrumental in helping Hunt run the fraudulent investments that the group peddled to their victims. While Hunt and Walters were the public faces of the operation, Kahan worked in the shadows, managing the logistics of the scams and handling the dirty work that came with keeping the operation running smoothly. His role in the BBC was crucial, as he helped maintain the illusion of success that attracted more and more wealthy individuals to invest. While the members of the Billionaire Boys Club were focused on building their empire of lies, their scams eventually led to the tragic murder of Ron Levin, a wealthy businessman and their target. Levin, a millionaire who had fallen for the BBC's fraudulent investment scheme, soon became a liability as Hunt and his crew realized they had to silence him to protect their operation. It was Levin's disappearance and eventual murder that would unravel the entire scheme, exposing the group's criminal activities. His death would ultimately serve as the tipping point, leading to the investigations and trials that would expose the dark world of the Billionaire Boys Club. The story of the Billionaire Boys Club wasn't just about a group of young men living a life of luxury. It was about how greed and the pursuit of power led them to make deadly choices. The main players in the story, Joe Hunt, William Walters, Andy Kahan, and the tragic victim, Ron Levin, each played a role in building and ultimately destroying the criminal empire they had created. Their actions would go down in history as a chilling reminder of the lengths some will go to when blinded by ambition and entitlement. The Billionaire Boys Club scheme was a classic example of a Ponzi operation, built on deception, false promises, and the manipulation of wealthy, unsuspecting victims. At its core, the plan was deceptively simple. The group promised extraordinary returns on investments, claims that seemed too good to ignore. But behind the facade of high returns and luxurious promises was a network of lies designed to keep the money flowing into the pockets of Joe Hunt and his accomplices. Joe Hunt, the mastermind, initially pitched the idea as an exclusive investment opportunity that catered to the elite. He presented himself as a savvy financier with insider knowledge, claiming he could offer returns far beyond what was available through traditional investment avenues. The appeal was clear. Wealthy individuals, eager to grow their fortunes, saw an opportunity to cash in on what seemed like a golden opportunity. Hunt and his team targeted businessmen and women from Los Angeles affluent circles, convincing them that the BBC was a private club of highly successful individuals with access to high-yield ventures. The scheme was expertly crafted to appear legitimate. Investors were promised returns of 100% or more in a short time, often using the allure of insider trading and high-risk ventures to explain the returns. However, there were no real investments, just a constant influx of money from new investors that was used to pay the older ones. The group relied on this cycle of money to stay afloat, ensuring that early investors were paid, while new funds covered the debts they had racked up from previous scams. As the BBC expanded its network of Victims, the fraud grew bolder. They used their elite status to maintain the illusion of success, throwing lavish parties and rubbing elbows with the rich and famous to gain credibility. But eventually, as the debts mounted and the lies began to unravel, the scheme started to fall apart, leading to a catastrophic fallout. As the Billionaire Boys Club's fraudulent empire expanded, so did the pressure to keep their elaborate scam from collapsing. But in the world of high-stakes deception, there's always a tipping point where lies and betrayal lead to irreversible consequences. For Joe Hunt and his fellow conmen, that moment came when they realized one of their most trusted investors, Ron Levin, had become a threat to their operation. Levin wasn't just another wealthy mark, he was a businessman with the resources and influence to expose them. And when Hunt and his crew realized they could no longer keep up the fight, they made the ultimate, chilling decision to eliminate Levin entirely. Ron Levin was a millionaire businessman who had become entangled with the Billionaire Boys Club through their fraudulent investment scheme. Like many others, he had been sold on the promise of substantial returns, lured by the charisma of Joe Hunt and the exclusivity of the club. But as time passed, Levin grew suspicious. He began to notice inconsistencies in the BBC's operations and questioned the legitimacy of the investments he had made. His doubts were confirmed when he learned that other investors were also being duped, and he began making moves to take legal action. For Hunt and the others in the BBC, Levin's growing suspicion was a ticking time bomb. He had become a liability, one whose knowledge of the scam could expose everything. In their eyes, the only way to protect themselves and keep their criminal enterprise from unraveling was to silence Levin before he could blow the whistle. This marked the beginning of the dark turn in their scheme, a turn from fraud to cold-blooded murder. The plan was executed in the most calculated manner. Hunt, along with his associates William Walters and Andy Kahan, lured Levin to a remote location. Under the guise of settling their financial differences, they promised him a meeting to resolve the issues with the investment. But their true intentions were far more sinister. Once they had him in their control, they quickly turned violent. The details of what exactly happened that night remain murky, but what's known is chilling. Ron Levin was beaten, bound, and eventually killed. His body was disposed of in such a way that it would take years for investigators to uncover the truth. The boys had acted quickly, but they hadn't accounted for the eventual fallout of their actions. Levin's disappearance raised immediate red flags. His friends and business associates were frantic, and authorities launched a full investigation into his sudden vanishing. But by then, the BBC's members had already gone into damage control mode, attempting to cover up their tracks and protect their secret. At first, they managed to maintain the illusion of normalcy, with Joe Hunt and his crew convincing people that Levin had simply run off, perhaps a result of the business's failure. They maintained their ruse by telling conflicting stories, each more absurd than the last. But the inconsistencies in their accounts and the mounting pressure eventually forced the authorities to dig deeper. For months, the murder seemed like a mystery, an open case with few clues. But as detectives closed in, they began to unravel the tangled web of lies, greed, and violence that had led to Levin's death. Eventually, it was the testimony of those closest to Hunt and the others that sealed the case. One by one, the members of the Billionaire Boys Club began to crack under the weight of their guilt. The truth about Levin's murder came to light, and with it, the full scope of the crimes that Hunt and his crew had committed. Ron Levin's life had been taken in a brutal, senseless act, but his death was the catalyst that would bring down the entire criminal operation. The murder of Ron Levin marked the tragic end of the Billionaire Boys Club's reign of terror. It also cemented the case as one of the most chilling in true crime history. A group of young, privileged men had not only defrauded the rich, they had crossed a line that would forever change their lives. Levin's murder served as the catalyst for a media frenzy that captured the public's imagination, helping to ignite a national obsession with high-profile criminal cases. And while the BBC's empire crumbled, the haunting question remained: how far would people go to protect their secrets? For Joe Hunt and his crew, the answer was clear: no line was too far to cross. The murder of Ron Levin and the unraveling of the Billionaire Boys Club sparked an outpouring of public outrage. Not only because of the brutal crime, but also because of the shocking level of entitlement and privilege the perpetrators exhibited. The case hit close to home for many Americans, especially in the 1980s, a decade known for its conspicuous displays of wealth, celebrity culture, and an increasing obsession with the rich and famous. This was a time when excess was glamorized, and the elite seemed untouchable until the story of the Billionaire Boys Club shattered that illusion. In the public's eyes, this wasn't just a case of a group of criminals preying on the wealthy. It was an indictment of a system that seemed to reward privilege and power without consequence. The BBC members weren't the typical image of criminals. They weren't down-and-out con artists or desperate individuals, but young men from affluent backgrounds with everything going for them: luxury, connections, and opportunities. To many, this was the ultimate betrayal. The boys weren't just stealing from their victims, they were living in a world where money, influence, and social standing were seen as shields from accountability. When the truth about Levin's murder came to light, it fueled public outrage, as the realization set in that the BBC was more than just a Ponzi scheme. It was a group of wealthy, privileged men who had become so accustomed to power that they believed they could take life without consequence. The cold-blooded nature of the murder was horrifying, but it was the complete lack of remorse or moral compass that sent shockwaves through the public. To some, it seemed as though Hunt and his crew were so detached from reality that they saw murder as a necessary evil to protect their riches. Media outlets jumped on the case, covering every new revelation in excruciating detail. The story quickly turned into a national sensation, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the people involved. The BBC's members were everything America had come to associate with the 1980s elite: young, rich, and with an air of invincibility. For many, this case symbolized the dangers of unchecked greed and privilege, an attitude that was pervasive at the time. The public's anger was amplified by the fact that it was not just a group of low-level criminals who were involved, but individuals who had manipulated their way into the lives of the rich and powerful. The BBC members had convinced their wealthy victims that they were part of an exclusive, high-return investment club, only to betray their trust and, in the case of Levin, resort to murder. The level of deception was staggering, and it made people question how far someone would go when the rewards of wealth seemed limitless. Moreover, the media frenzy surrounding the trial further stoked the flames of public outrage. The courtroom drama played out like a soap opera, with each new revelation about the murder and the deceitful practices of the Billionaire Boys Club fueling the spectacle. Hunt and his associates seemed increasingly disconnected from the gravity of their actions, which angered many who felt that these young men, with their sense of entitlement, needed to be held accountable for their crimes. The case brought to light the dark side of the American dream, the idea that with wealth and power, one could escape the consequences of their actions. The public's outrage wasn't just about a single murder, it was about the larger message it sent about the corrosive effects of privilege and how the pursuit of wealth could blind individuals to basic human decency. In a society obsessed with the rich and powerful, the Billionaire Boys Club's fall from grace was a sobering reminder of the dangers of living in a world where success is measured only by money and status. Ultimately, the public's anger was not just directed at the perpetrators, but also at a system that had allowed such a group to thrive in the first place. The fallout from this case didn't just ruin the lives of the men involved, it exposed the cracks in the very fabric of society, making people question the value placed on wealth and the lengths people would go to preserve it. The story of the Billionaire Boys Club would forever be etched in the minds of the public, not just as a crime story, but as a cautionary tale of excess, greed, and the deadly consequences of living above the law. The courtroom drama that followed the murder of Ron Levin was nothing short of sensational. Joe Hunt, along with his accomplices, faced intense scrutiny as the prosecution laid out a damning case. The trial was filled with shocking revelations, from the cold-hearted nature of Levin's murder to the manipulative tactics the Billionaire Boys Club used to lure their victims. The defense attempted to downplay their actions, painting Hunt and the others as misguided, but the evidence was overwhelming. As the case unfolded, it became clear these privileged young men believed their wealth could shield them from justice, but they were wrong. The aftermath of the Billionaire Boys Club case was as dramatic as the trial itself. Joe Hunt and his accomplices were convicted, and their lives were irrevocably changed. The case left a stain on the reputation of the wealthy elite in Beverly Hills, casting a shadow of distrust over the world they inhabited. Media outlets continued to scrutinize every detail, making the trial a defining moment in the public's fascination with true crime. For the victims, however, the emotional and financial damage was lasting. The scandal prompted many to question the dangerous intersection of wealth, privilege, and unchecked ambition. As the dust settled on the Billionaire Boys Club case, many believed justice had been served, but questions lingered. How many more dark secrets were hidden behind the walls of Beverly Hills mansions? Could there be more victims, more ruthless schemes yet to be uncovered? The world had watched as these young men were exposed, but some believe the true extent of their crimes may never fully come to light. The billion-dollar question remains: how far are people willing to go for wealth and power? As the story fades from headlines, the chilling truth might still be lurking in the shadows. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and drop comment below.